Welcome to the Soothing Sleep Stories channel. I'm Bento, and here we take it easy on your mind and dive into fascinating stories, told at just the right pace to help you relax, or maybe even fall asleep. First of all, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you like this kind of calm content, full of curiosities and made with love, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next time travels that we take here. Today, we begin our journey through the mysteries and deeds of one of the most legendary orders in history. This is the first video of Arc 1, the genesis of the Knights Templar. We will discover how the Order of the Temple was born amid the Crusades, and how its first knights laid the foundations for what would become one of the most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages. So turn off the lights, get cozy, and come with me to take the first steps in this fascinating story. Definitely, prepare yourself for a serene and immersive journey. Sit back, take a deep breath, and let the narrative envelop you. The context of the First Crusade. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine, if you can, a world lit not by electricity, but by the flickering flame of a candle, by the golden glow of sunlight streaming through the stained glass of a cathedral, or by the crackling fire of a fireplace in a cold, damp stone castle. A world where time was measured not in nanoseconds, but in the seasons, in the slow turning of an hourglass, in the ringing of church bells marking the hours of prayer. It is the late 11th century. Europe was a complex mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and fiefdoms, a patchwork of fragile loyalties and fierce ambitions. Life, for the vast majority of people, was short, brutish, and rooted in the land. The predominant smell was not of pollution, but of wet earth, of wood smoke, of farm animals, and, in the crowded cities, of something far less poetic. In this scenario, faith was not a lifestyle choice or a weekend hobby. It was the very air one breathed, the lens through which all of existence was understood. The Catholic Church was the only truly pan-European institution, a monumental force that united kings and peasants under the same heavenly vault. Earthly life was seen as a brief and often painful prelude to eternity, and the salvation of the soul was the supreme concern. And at the geographic and spiritual center of this mental map, shining like a distant jewel, was a city, Jerusalem. For the medieval Christian, Jerusalem was not just a dot on the map. It was the scene of the most sacred events of his faith. It was the place where Christ had walked, preached, died, and risen again. It was the navel of the world. For centuries, Christian pilgrims had made the long and dangerous journey to the Holy Land. It was the ultimate act of devotion, a way to purify the soul, to touch the sacred. These pilgrims traveled through Muslim-controlled lands, but for the most part, under the more tolerant caliphates, they were allowed to visit their holy sites as long as they paid the proper taxes and behaved themselves. It was a workable, if sometimes tense, arrangement. But the Middle Eastern chessboard was constantly shifting. A new power had arisen, sweeping across the region with formidable force. The Seljuk Turks, originally from the steppes of Central Asia and recently converted to Sunni Islam, were fierce warriors and expansionists. They conquered Persia, Iraq, and gradually most of Anatolia, modern Turkey, which had once been the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Christian heir to the Roman Empire. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuks dealt a devastating blow to the Byzantine army, capturing the emperor himself. It was a shock that reverberated throughout the Christian world. With the Seljuk advance, the situation of Christian pilgrims became much more precarious. The routes became more dangerous. The new masters were often less tolerant than the previous ones, and stories that reached Europe were of harassment, robbery, and violence. To the European mind, this was more than just a geopolitical inconvenience. It was a desecration. The holiest place on earth was being defiled and access to it denied. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the richest and most magnificent city in Christendom, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios III watched with growing alarm the Turkish advance. He saw his empire, the eastern wall of Christendom, being eroded piece by piece. In despair, he swallowed his pride. Despite the long and bitter theological rivalry between the Orthodox Church of Constantinople and the Catholic Church of Rome, and the Great Schism of 1054, still an open wound, Alexius sent emissaries to the west. His letter, addressed to Pope Urban II, was a calculated plea. He asked for help, requesting that the Pope recruit mercenary knights from Europe to help him repel the Turks and reclaim the lost lands of Anatolia. He probably envisioned a contingent of professional warriors who would fight under his command, be paid, and then return home. He had no idea of the Pandora's box he was about to open. Pope Urban II was a shrewd politician and diplomat, as well as a religious leader. He saw in Alexius's appeal an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to heal the schism between the churches by reaffirming the primacy of Rome, an opportunity to project papal power over the kings and princes of Europe, and perhaps most importantly, an opportunity to give a sacred purpose to Europe's warrior class. The feudal knights were a restless and violent force. Their private wars and land disputes kept the continent in a state of almost perpetual conflict. Urban saw a way to channel this aggressive energy outward against a common enemy of the faith, an armed pilgrimage, a holy war. So in the cold month of November in the year 1095, the Pope called a great council in the city of Clermont, France. Hundreds of bishops, abbots, and nobles gathered. At the end of the council, in an open field to accommodate the crowd, Urban II delivered one of the most influential speeches in history. We do not have an exact transcript, but the chronicles of the time give us the essence of his words. He spoke with overwhelming passion. He described the alleged atrocities committed against Eastern Christians and pilgrims. He painted a vivid picture of the desecration of holy places. And then he made a radical proposal. He called on the knights of Christendom to stop fighting each other and unite to march east to liberate Jerusalem. And to sweeten the offer, he made a promise of transcendent power. Anyone who took up the cross and embarked on this journey, whether dying along the way or in battle, would receive complete remission of all their sins. Imagine the impact of this. At a time when the fear of hell was palpable and penance for sins was a heavy burden, the Pope was offering a direct shortcut to heaven. It was an offer they couldn't refuse. The crowd's response was immediate and electric. A unanimous cry echoed across the field, a phrase that would become the movement's motto. Deus vult, Deus vult. God wants it, God wants it. The spark had been lit. Preachers traveled throughout Europe, spreading the Pope's message. The idea caught fire in the popular imagination, turning into something far greater and more chaotic than either Urban or Alexius had ever imagined. The promise of salvation, adventure, and for the more pragmatic nobles, the chance to conquer new lands and riches in the East, was a potent combination. It was the beginning of the First Crusade. Here, history presents us with one of its most fascinating and tragic curiosities, a disorganized prelude to the march of the nobles. Before the great feudal armies could organize themselves, the Pope's message fired the imagination of the masses. A charismatic and somewhat scruffy preacher named Peter the Hermit rode across northern France and Germany on his donkey, preaching the crusade with hypnotic fervor. It attracted a huge and unruly crowd, made up mostly of peasants, the poor, some women, children, and even a few low-ranking knights. This movement became known as the Crusade of the Poor, with no discipline, no adequate supplies, and only a vague understanding of geography. Tens of thousands of people simply began walking east, believing that God would provide. Their journey was a disaster. They pillaged cities in Hungary and the Balkans to survive, leading to bloody conflicts with the local Christian populations. When they finally reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexius was horrified by the unruly mob. He quickly transported them across the Bosporus to Anatolia, where, without any competent military leadership, they were almost immediately ambushed and massacred by Turkish forces. It was a brutal and melancholy end to a movement born of pure but misguided faith. As the Crusade of the Poor met its tragic end, the true armies of the First Crusade, led by some of the most powerful nobles in Europe, men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto, were finally assembling. These were not peasant comforters. They were professional warriors, covered in iron mail, accompanied by knights, archers, and a long line of supplies. They represented the military might of Western Christendom, now united under the symbol of the Red Cross sewn into their tunics. Europe was mobilizing. A wave of iron and faith was about to break upon the shores of the Levant. The world was about to change. And in the heart of that change, in the heat and dust and blood of the Holy Land, the seeds of a strange new institution would be planted. An order of monks who were also soldiers, an idea that could only be born in a time of such intense fervor and contradictions. The stage was set, the journey to Jerusalem had begun, and with it, the long and winding road that would lead to the creation of the Knights Templar. Jerusalem is conquered by the Crusaders, and so, while the bones of the ill-fated Crusade of the Poor whitened in the Anatolian sun, the armies of the nobles, a torrent of iron, faith, and ambition, began their slow and arduous march eastward. This was no weekend excursion. It was a monumental expedition, a logistical feat that bordered on the impossible for the time. Imagine tens of thousands of men and a few fearless or simply hopeless women, moving like a walking city through unknown and hostile territory. The constant sound was a chaotic symphony, the metallic clang of thousands of chainmail coats rubbing against each other, the creak of wooden wagon wheels on rocky ground, the nervous neighing of war horses, the murmur of Latin prayers mixed with Frankish, Norman, and Provençal dialects, and the ever-present buzz of flies attracted by sweat, garbage, and inevitable disease. The smell was a potent mix of dust kicked up by thousands of feet and hooves, of human and animal sweat soaking into wool and leather, and the sickly sweet odor of decay that always followed in the wake of so large an army. The journey was a brutal test of endurance. The heat of the Anatolian desert was as formidable an enemy as any Turkish warrior. Men dressed in thick woolen robes and covered in metal cooked inside their own armor. Water was scarce and often contaminated, and hunger was a constant companion. Still, they persevered. Driven by a combination of religious fervor, the leadership of their lords, and the simple lack of any option to turn back. Their first major test came at the city of Nicaea in 1097. The city, surrounded by a lake and formidable walls, was their first major obstacle. The Crusaders laid siege to the city, but it was the cunning of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios that secured victory. While the Crusaders prepared for a major assault, Alexios secretly negotiated the surrender of the city with the Turkish garrison. One fine morning, the Crusaders awoke to see, to their great dismay, the imperial standards of Byzantium flying over the walls. Alexios had taken the city for himself, denying the Crusader leaders their glory and, more importantly, their plunder. The city of Nicaea was the first of many lessons in subtle and, to them, exasperating Byzantine diplomacy. They moved on, a little wiser and a lot more suspicious of their Eastern allies. The real test by fire, the ordeal that nearly broke the crusade, came next, at the ancient and magnificent city of Antioch. The walls of Antioch were legendary, a masterpiece of Roman military engineering, reinforced over the centuries. The siege that followed was a saga of suffering and despair that lasted nearly 8 months, from the autumn of 1097 to the summer of 1098. The winter was particularly cruel. Rain turned the Crusader camp into a sea of cold mud. Supplies ran out. Men ate their own horses, then rats, then shoe leather, and according to some grim accounts, worse. Disease swept through the camp and morale plummeted. Knights who had left castles in Europe to fight for the faith now died of starvation and distemper, cursing the dusty earth beneath their feet. Many deserted, including prominent figures who fled in the dead of night, to eternal shame. The army was on the verge of collapse, and then, as so often happens in stories of faith and despair, a miracle occurred, or perhaps a masterstroke in war psychology. A Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew began to have visions. He claimed that St. Andrew had appeared to him in a dream, revealing the exact location where the sacred lance, the spear that the Roman centurion Longinus had used to pierce Christ's side on the cross, was buried right there, under the floor of St. Peter's Cathedral, inside Antioch. The city, in fact, had only been taken thanks to the treachery of an Armenian guard, who allowed a small group of crusaders led by Bohemond of Taranto to scale a section of the wall and open the gates. After the capture of the city, the Crusaders found themselves in an ironic situation. They were now besieged within Antioch by a huge Turkish relief army that had arrived too late to save the original garrison. Hunger and despair returned with a vengeance. It was in this moment of utter terror that the story of Peter Bartholomew came to life. The leaders, desperate for anything that might lift the spirits of their exhausted and terrified men, authorized a dig. And to everyone's amazement, after digging for a while, Peter Bartholomew himself jumped into the hole and emerged holding a piece of ancient metal. It was the sacred spear. This is the widely known historical fact, the discovery of the sacred spear at Antioch. The authenticity of the artifact was, to say the least, doubtful. The papal legate present at the crusade denounced it as a fraud, but it did not matter. For the common soldiers, it was a divine sign. God was with them. Morale, which had previously been crawling at rock bottom, soared to the sky. With the sacred spear tied to a standard and carried in front of them, the emaciated and starving crusaders marched out in battle formation to face the much larger and better fed Turkish army. And against all odds, they won. The Turkish cavalry, perhaps surprised by the suicidal fury of the charge, broke and fled. Antioch was safe. The crusade was saved. After Antioch, the Crusader leaders, as usual, spent precious months arguing over who would get control of the newly conquered city, practicing the noble art of diplomacy, which at the time looked a lot like sullen children fighting over the best toy. Finally, the bulk of the army, impatient and fed up with the bickering of their superiors, forced the march on. They had come for Jerusalem, and it was to Jerusalem that they would go. The army that marched south was a shadow of the one that had left Europe. They were fewer in number, but tougher, more hardened, and united by a fanaticism forged in the fires of suffering. They were the survivors. As they approached their final goal, the landscape became more arid, more biblical. They crossed the coast of what is now Lebanon, passing cities that paid them tribute to avoid destruction. And then, one June morning in the year 1099, they climbed a hill and saw it. Jerusalem. For these men who had traveled thousands of miles, who had seen their friends and brothers die of hunger, disease, and battle, this was a moment of overwhelming emotion. The chronicles tell of hardened warriors falling to their knees and weeping, kissing the ground. The city of God, the object of all their praise, was finally within their sight. But the vision soon gave way to harsh reality. Jerusalem's defenses were even more impressive than those of Antioch. High, thick walls, a deep moat, and a well-supplied and determined Fatimid garrison. The Crusaders, on the other hand, were in a barren land, with little food and, crucially, almost no timber, to build the indispensable siege engines, such as assault towers and catapults. The region around Jerusalem had been deliberately deforested by the garrison to deprive them of material. The summer sun was relentless, and the nearby water wells were poisoned. The siege began badly. A barefoot religious procession around the walls was met with jeers and insults from the defenders. A first attack, made on impulse and without adequate equipment, was easily repelled. The old familiar despair began to set in again. It was then that luck, or providence, intervened once more, in the form of a marginal but absolutely decisive historical curiosity. A small fleet of Genoese ships, sailing the Mediterranean, docked at the nearby port of Jaffa. These sailors were not driven by faith alone. They were pragmatic merchants who saw an opportunity. Realizing the Crusaders' desperate situation, they made a remarkable decision. They dismantled their own ships. The beams, planks, and rigging of 6 ships were laboriously transported overland to the Crusader camp. Suddenly, the army engineers had the materials they needed. Working feverishly day and night, they built 2 huge wooden siege towers, rolling giants covered with wet animal skins to protect them from enemy fire. The final assault was scheduled for mid-July. The night before, under cover of darkness, the Crusaders dismantled one of the towers and secretly moved it to a different, less defended section of the wall. A brilliant stroke of misdirection. At dawn on July 15th, 1099, the attack began. The noise was deafening. The battle cry, Deus vult. The sound of catapult stones crashing against the walls. The sound of thousands of arrows. The screams of the attackers and defenders. For hours, the battle raged under a scorching sun. Finally, the siege tower commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon managed to get close enough to the wall. The tower's drawbridge was lowered, and a handful of knights, led by a man named Letalde, were the first to set foot on the walls of Jerusalem. The defensive line had been broken. What followed was one of the darkest passages in the history of the Crusades. The pent-up fury and frustration of 3 years of unspeakable suffering were unleashed upon the city. The Crusaders, who saw themselves as the avengers of Christ, made no distinction between soldiers and civilians, men, women, or children. The sanctity of the place was drowned in a sea of blood. Muslims and Jews, who had fought side by side to defend their city, were massacred indiscriminately in the streets, in their homes, and even in the mosques and synagogues where they had sought refuge. The Chronicles, written by the Crusaders themselves and filled with a fervor that seems shocking to us today, describe streets where blood reached men's ankles. As night fell, the killing subsided. The Crusaders, blood-stained and exhausted, walked to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. There, stripped of their armor, they prayed, tears of joy and devotion streaming down their faces. They had done it. The holy city was in Christian hands. The First Crusade had achieved its impossible goal, but in conquering Jerusalem, they created a new and immediate problem. They had a small Christian kingdom, an island, and a vast ocean of hostile territory, and pilgrims from all over Europe would now begin to come in even greater numbers to visit liberated Jerusalem. The journey to the city was perilous, but now even the roads leading from the coast into the holy interior were infested with bandits and enemy patrols. Conquering Jerusalem had been one thing. Maintaining it and protecting those who came to venerate it would be an entirely different challenge. And it was precisely from this new and dangerous reality that a new idea, a new way of serving God, was about to be born. The need to protect pilgrims. The dust of battle settles slowly, but the smell of blood takes much longer to fade, lingering in the ancient stones and the consciousness of the conquerors. After the cathartic fury and carnage that followed the fall of the walls, Christian Jerusalem awoke to an eerily silent morning. The silence was not one of peace, but of exhaustion. The void left by the end of violence. The first task of the city's new lords was macabre, but necessary. Clean-up. Bodies were piled up and burned. The streets were washed with buckets of water in an attempt to wash away the stains and stench of death. Slowly, a new, fragile order began to be imposed upon the chaos. The Crusader leaders, practical men beneath their armor of faith, met to decide the fate of their prize. What to do with a city conquered at such terrible cost? The answer was to create a kingdom, a Christian kingdom, in the heart of the Holy Land. But who would be king? The crown was offered to the most prominent and pious of the nobles, Godfrey of Bouillon. In a gesture of humility that has become legendary, Geoffrey refused the title of king, declaring that he would not wear a golden crown in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he accepted the more modest title of Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, the advocate or protector of the Holy Sepulchre. But this new and pious kingdom faced an existential problem from its first breath. Many of the knights and soldiers who made up the Crusader army felt that their mission was accomplished. They had answered the Pope's call. They had endured unspeakable trials. They had marched thousands of miles, and they had liberated Jerusalem. Their vow was fulfilled. Their sins were supposedly forgiven. And frankly, they were homesick, missing the rain and green mud of Normandy, the wine of their homeland in Aquitaine, the comfort, however relative, of their own castles. Once the ports were secured, a steady stream of veterans began the journey back to Europe. They had come, they had seen, they had conquered, and now they just wanted to go home to tell the tales, and perhaps show off a relic or two of dubious authenticity. This diaspora of heroes left Geoffrey, and later his more pragmatic brother Baldwin I, who had no problem accepting the title of King of Jerusalem after Geoffrey's untimely death, in an incredibly precarious position. They were the rulers of a kingdom that was little more than a series of fortified towns and castles, Christian islands in a vast and hostile Muslim sea. The local population was largely unsympathetic to them, and their neighbors, from the Fatimids of Egypt to the emirs of Damascus and Aleppo, saw the new kingdom as a temporary affront, a thorn in their side to be removed as soon as the opportunity arose. The kingdom of Jerusalem, or Outre-mer as the Franks called it, meaning the land beyond the sea, had miles of borders to defend and too few soldiers to do it. And amid this geopolitical fragility, a new kind of people began to arrive on the coast. They were the pilgrims. If before the pilgrimage was an act of devotion for the bravest, now, with the news of the liberation of Jerusalem spreading throughout Europe, it became a burning desire for tens of thousands of people. They were men and women from all social classes. They were weavers, millers, merchants, monks, wealthy peasants, and even minor nobles who had not participated in the crusade. They sold their possessions, said goodbye to their families, and boarded overcrowded ships in Marseille, Genoa, or Venice, enduring a perilous sea voyage to reach the Holy Land. They disembarked at the port of Jaffa, the main gateway to the kingdom. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of pale Europeans, many of whom had never seen the sea before, stepped onto the hot sand, dazzled by the blinding light of the eastern sun. Their hearts were filled with pious fervor. They had arrived. They were just a few days' walk away from kneeling at the very spot where Christ lived and died. What they did not understand, in their pious innocence, was that the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. The road from Jaffa to Jerusalem, a distance of about 45 miles, was a death trap. The road, if it could be called that, was little more than a dusty, rocky trail that wound through the Judean hills. It was a landscape of stark beauty and hidden danger. The heat was oppressive, water was scarce, but the real danger did not come from nature. It came from the men hiding among the rocks and in the narrow gorges. They were groups of Bedouin bandits who saw the pilgrims as easy prey. They were Fatimid reconnaissance patrols from the coastal fortress of Ashkelon, which had remained in Muslim hands for decades. They were simply resentful locals who were seizing the opportunity to exact revenge on the Frankish invaders. For a group of unarmed pilgrims, the trek was a nightmare. Every bend in the road, every shadow among the olive trees might hide death. The midday silence was often broken by the sudden war cry, the whistle of arrows, and the swift, brutal attack of men on horseback. The stories that reached Jerusalem grew more and more terrible. Entire groups of pilgrims were found massacred on the roadside, stripped of everything they owned. Their pious journeys ended in tragedy, just a few miles from their sacred destination. It was a cruel irony. The Christians had conquered Jerusalem, but they could not secure the road to it. The very purpose of the kingdom was undermined by its inability to provide even the most basic security. This situation gave rise to a sort of marginal historical curiosity, a shadowy economy of banditry. Not all attackers killed their victims immediately, realizing that many of these pilgrims, although simply dressed, came from wealthy families in Europe. The more cunning bandits developed a system of kidnapping and ransom. A captured pilgrim could fetch a good price. This macabre industry turned the Jaffa route into a manhunt. Raiders became adept at sizing up their prey, looking for signs of wealth, a finer cloth, an accent that indicated noble birth, or simply the robustness of someone who looked like they could withstand prolonged captivity while ransom negotiations were underway. Groups of pilgrims were captured and held in hideouts in the hills, while messengers were sent to Jerusalem or even back to Europe to demand payment. It was a cruel business, fueled by the religious fervor of some and the predatory greed of others. The road to heaven lay, quite literally, through a market in human lives. King Baldwin I, and later his cousin Baldwin II, did what they could. They organized armed patrols, but their resources were desperately limited. Their small force of knights had to garrison castles, defend borders, and be ready to face entire armies. They could not afford to spread their men along a single road, however vital. They occasionally escorted large and important parties, but the average pilgrim, traveling in a small group of friends or family, was on his own. The king might be the ruler of Jerusalem, but he was not the master of the road that led to it. The turning point, the moment when the crisis reached an unbearable climax, occurred at Easter in the year 1119. This tragic event is a widely known historical fact and is considered the direct catalyst for the founding of the Order of the Temple. During Holy Week, a large group of pilgrims, numbering about 700 people, decided to travel from Jerusalem to the Jordan River to reenact the baptism of Christ. Feeling safe in such a large group, they ventured into the Judean desert, but they were being watched. A Fatimid army from Ashkelon ambushed them. What followed was a massacre. Unarmed and panicked, the pilgrims had no chance. 300 were killed, and about 60 were captured to be sold as slaves. News of the disaster reached Jerusalem and caused a wave of shock and horror. King Baldwin II immediately rode out with his knights to retaliate, but it was too late. The road was strewn with bodies. The greatest celebration of the Christian calendar had been stained with the blood of the faithful. This Passover massacre was the final straw. It made it painfully clear to everyone that the situation was untenable. What good was it to have liberated the Holy Sepulchre if Christians could not even visit the Jordan River in safety? The kingdom was failing in its most fundamental mission. The piety, courage, and resources of the secular state were not enough. The problem required a new solution, a radical idea. It was in this climate of crisis, fear, and frustration that a small group of French knights, who had remained in the Holy Land after the Crusade, began to have serious conversations. They saw the suffering of the pilgrims every day. They saw the helplessness of the king, and as men of deep faith and military vocation themselves, they felt a calling to do something about it. A knight from the Champagne region, a devout and determined middle-aged man named Hugo de Payens, felt this calling more keenly than anyone else. He looked at the problem and saw not just a military challenge, but a spiritual calling. What if, he thought, the sword could be used not just to conquer, but to protect? What if a warrior's life could be devoted entirely to the service of God, protecting his most vulnerable travelers? A new seed was germinating in the blood-stained soil of the Holy Land. The idea of a brotherhood of warrior monks, a religious order with swords, was about to take shape. Desperate need was about to give birth to one of the most famous and mysterious institutions of the Middle Ages, the emergence of the idea of a religious military order. The idea was not born in a flash of divine inspiration, but germinated slowly, like a stubborn seed in the hard, blood-stained soil of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. After the horror of the Easter massacre of 1119, a heavy gloom and sense of failure hung over the holy city. The air, normally vibrant with the fervor of pilgrims, seemed charged with a silent, agonizing question. What was it all for? What was the point of conquest, sacrifice, the creation of a kingdom, if the faithful could not even walk in safety to pray in their holiest places? Victory seemed hollow, liberation an illusion. In this atmosphere of disillusionment, a small group of secular knights met regularly. They were not the great princes of the kingdom, with their complex politics and territorial disputes. but rather men of lesser nobility, veterans who had chosen to remain in the Holy Land out of a deep sense of duty and devotion. The central figure among them was Hugh de Payens, a knight of Champagne in his middle years. Hugo was not a brash young man seeking glory. He was an experienced man whose faith had been tested and hardened in the brutal realities of Outremer. He had seen the bravery on the battlefields and the terror in the eyes of the pilgrims. His soul was a curious mixture of monastic piety and soldierly pragmatism. At his side was his relative and close friend, Godfrey of Saint-Omer, a Fleming equally devout and resolute. Together, they and a handful of other companions felt the weight of the crisis in a very personal way. Their conversations did not take place in the opulent halls of the royal palace, but in modest rooms, under the flickering light of oil lamps, as the heat of the day gave way to the cool evening breeze that blew over the Judean hills. What could they do? They were knights. Their trade was war, but their swords were in the service of feudal lords, obliged to answer the king's call to pitched battles and sieges. The pilgrims' problem was different. It was a war of attrition, a constant and diffuse threat that required a permanent and dedicated presence on the dangerous roads. It was in these nocturnal discussions, probably washed down with a local wine and accompanied by the distant sound of singing from a nearby church, that the idea began to take shape in a bold and, to the mentality of the time, profoundly strange ways. Medieval society had very well-defined boxes for its elite men. There was the man of prayer, the monk, who renounced the world, violence, and material goods to dedicate his life to God through contemplation, work, and song. His weapon was faith. His shield was the cloister. Then there was the man of war, the knight, immersed in the world, whose life was defined by violence, pride, feudal loyalty, and the pursuit of honor and wealth. They were two parallel universes, two mutually exclusive vocations. The monk prayed for the knight's soul, and the knight, ideally, protected the monk's monastery. The radical idea that emerged in Hugo de Payens' mind was simply to blur the line between these two boxes. What if a man could be both at once? What if patrolling a dusty road and protecting a group of frightened pilgrims could be a form of prayer in itself? What if the sword, rather than being an instrument of sin and pride, could be consecrated to the direct service of God, like a monk's crucifix? The idea was to create a new form of religious life, an order of monks who were also elite knights, a brotherhood that would take the traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but instead of working in a field or copying manuscripts, would take up spear and sword to wage perpetual war against those who threatened the pilgrims. This was much more than just creating a police force for the Jaffa Road. It was a theological revolution. The idea that monks could shed blood was, at first glance, anathema, a contradiction in terms. However, the ground had already been prepared. The First Crusade had popularized the concept of holy war, an idea that had its roots in St. Augustine's theology of just war, bellum and ustum. This is our widely known historical fact. The doctrine of just war, which argued that violence could be morally legitimate under certain conditions, if the cause was just, if it was declared by a legitimate authority, and if the intention was right. The Crusade had taken this idea a step further, turning war into a pilgrimage, an act of penance. Hugh and his companions were taking this logic to its ultimate conclusion. If war could be a temporary pious act, because it could not be a permanent religious vocation, they would not see themselves as aggressors, but as protectors. Their violence would be an act of charity, defending the weak. Apparently, Necessity was the mother not only of invention, but also of creative theology. The audacity of the concept is even more evident when we consider the marginal historical curiosity of the context of Jerusalem at that time. There already existed a religious order dedicated to service in the Holy Land, the Order of St. John, later known as the Knights Hospitaller. Founded even before the First Crusade, its mission was entirely one of charity. They maintained an extraordinary hospital in Jerusalem, caring for sick and injured pilgrims with remarkable dedication and skill. They were monks dedicated to healing and comfort. They were the embodiment of Christian mercy. Hugh's idea was not to improve upon the Hospitaller model, but to create something completely different, almost its opposite. Where the Hospitallers had healed the wounds of attacked pilgrims, Hugh's new order would seek to prevent attacks from happening in the first place. If the Hospitallers' calling was to be the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, Hugh's calling was to build a fence at the top. The existence of a purely charitable and non-military order highlights how revolutionary and shocking the proposal for a military order was. After months of deliberation, feeling that their idea was mature enough, Hugh of Payens and Godfried of Saint-Omer decided that the time had come to act. They needed the sanction of the two highest authorities in the kingdom, the secular power and the religious power. They requested an audience with King Baldwin II and the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Gourmand de Picquigny. Imagine the scene at the Tower of David, the royal citadel of Jerusalem. Baldwin II, a war-hardened king, sits on his throne, his face etched by the desert sun and the worries of ruling a kingdom constantly on the brink. At his side stood Patriarch Gourmand, the highest representative of the Church in the Holy Land, dressed in his robes, representing the weight of tradition and canon law. And before them stood two knights, Hugh and Godfried, not in shining armor, but probably in simple tunics, presenting their extraordinary proposal. Hugh, a spokesman, would have spoken with the restrained passion of a man absolutely convinced of his cause. He would not have spoken of glory or conquest. He would have spoken of his anguish at seeing pilgrims massacred. He would have spoken of the Christian duty to protect the weak. And he would have presented his solution, a small brotherhood of poor knights of Christ, willing to renounce all worldly goods, all family connections, and devote their lives entirely to a single, humble task, patrolling the roads and ensuring the safe passage of pilgrims. They would ask for no lands or titles. They would ask only for food, lodging, and the blessing of the king and the church to embark on this strange and holy vocation. Baldwin II listened attentively. As king, his problem was practical. He did not have enough men, and here were experienced knights offering to solve his most pressing problem for free. The offer was, from a purely military and financial point of view, too good to refuse. He had nothing to lose and potentially everything to gain. If the idea failed, it would be just another noble attempt that came to nothing. If it worked, it would solve a logistical and public relations nightmare. The Gourmand Patriarch, for his part, would have had more reservations. Theology was his domain. The idea of warrior monks was disconcerting. Yet he was also a man who lived in the reality of Jerusalem. He heard confessions, consoled grieving families, and saw the fear in the eyes of newcomers. The crisis was real and spiritual. Hugo's proposal, though radical, was rooted in an undeniably pious purpose, charity and the protection of the faithful. The pressing need and the obvious sincerity and devotion of Hugh and his companion probably overcame their doctrinal doubts. And so, around the year 1120, in a decision that would change the face of Christianity and medieval warfare, King Baldwin II and Patriarch Gormon de Pikin Nisiguin de Pikini gave their approval. They accepted the proposal. The king granted them a space to live and operate. The church gave them its blessing to live as a religious congregation, following a rule yet to be defined. The idea had come out of the shadows of nocturnal conversations and into the light of official sanction. It was no longer the dream of a handful of men. It was a nascent institution, under the patronage of the King of Jerusalem. The paradox had been embraced. The warrior monk was about to be born. A small group of men, now officially sanctioned, prepared to take their vows and begin their mission. The seed had sprouted. Now I needed a name, a house, and an identity. Hugh de Payens and the 9 founding knights. The approval of King Baldwin II and Patriarch Gormond was not announced with trumpets or celebrated with banquets. It was an administrative act, a pragmatic nod, and a cautious blessing given to an idea that still seemed more like a whisper than a rallying cry. For Hugo de Payens and his companions, however, that moment changed everything. They were no longer just a group of pious veterans with an eccentric idea. They were now a recognized institution, however tiny and fragile. They had a sanctioned purpose. They were allowed to exist. The next step was formalization, the transformation from men of arms to men of God, at least on paper. In a solemn but probably very simple ceremony, held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the spiritual epicenter of their world. A small group of knights knelt before the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Candlelight danced on the stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and touch the history contained in this sacred place. The smell was of ancient incense and cold stone. The sound was the Patriarch's muttered Latin, and the firm, if perhaps a little nervous, responses of men more accustomed to giving orders on a battlefield than reciting monastic vows. One by one, they took the 3 vows that had formed the backbone of monastic life for centuries: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Imagine the scene. Hugo de Payens, the visionary leader, a man in his 50s, his face lined with sun and worry, renouncing all his personal possessions. Godfrey of St. Homer, his faithful Flemish companion, vowing celibacy, a drastic life change for a medieval nobleman. And the others, hardened warriors, men who lived in a world of pride, lineage, and inheritance, submitting their will to that of a superior and vowing to own nothing, not even the armor they wore or the horse they rode. They were 9 knights in all. This number 9 became part of the founding legend of the order. This is our widely known historical fact. For a long time, the story was told as if there had been only 9 of them. For almost a decade, a romantic image of a small band of brothers against the world. The reality is, as always, a little more complex. But there is no doubt that the initial core was small and dedicated. History records the names of the 2 leaders, Hugh of Payens and Godfrey of St. Homer. The exact identity of all the other 7 is a puzzle to historians, as the lists vary somewhat. Names such as Payon de Montdidier, Archambault de Saint-Aignan, Geoffrey Bizot and Rosal appear in the chronicles. They were all Frankish knights, men who shared a language, a culture, and now a radical vocation. Within this small founding group, we find our marginal historical curiosity, a family connection that would prove to be of monumental, almost predestined importance. One of the 9 knights was a Burgundian nobleman named André de Montbard. He was a devoted warrior like the others, but what made him special was his nephew in Europe. His nephew was a man named Bernard, the abbot of the monastery of Clairvaux. This Bernard of Clairvaux was no ordinary abbot. He was quite possibly the most influential man in all of Christendom at the time. A brilliant theologian, a prolific writer, a charismatic orator, and a maker of kings and popes. His word carried immense weight. His uncle Andrew's presence right there at the beginning of it all could not have been a mere coincidence. It was a direct and personal connection with one of the greatest centers of spiritual and political power in Europe. This small seed of pious nepotism, planted early on, would bear spectacular fruit for the order in the future. With the vows taken, they needed a name. At first, they did not have the grand title by which they would be known. They adopted a name that reflected their mission and their new self-imposed status. Pauperis Commilitones Christi, the poor companions in arms of Christ. It was a humble name, almost a declaration of intent. They were not the rich, the proud, or the mighty knights. They were the poor. And herein lies one of the most interesting and, in a twinkling of an eye, humorous paradoxes of its founding. The vow of poverty was individual, not corporate. A Knight Templar could not have a single penny in his pocket. He could not own his own horse or even an extra pair of boots. Anything he had was on loan from the order. But the order itself, the order could and would become fabulously rich. This little legal and theological distinction was the key to everything. To function, a knight needed very expensive equipment, a war horse, a strong steed trained for battle. It was worth the same as a small farm. Add to this a second horse for travel, a squire to attend him, a full coat of mail, a helmet, a sword, a shield, a lance. The cost was astronomical. The idea of poor knights was, in practice, a contradiction. They could only be individually poor because they were collectively financed. At first, this finance came from charity, donations from the king and other pious nobles in Jerusalem. But the structure that allowed a penniless monk to ride into battle on a war machine worth a fortune was already in place. It was a brilliant business model, disguised as a vow of poverty. During the early years of about 1120 onwards, the lives of the poor knights were anything but glamorous. They were a strange sight on the streets of Jerusalem, a small, obscure group, probably the object of curiosity and perhaps even some derision. While other orders, such as the Hospitallers, were already large and respected institutions, they were the new, strange experiment. They did not have their own buildings or a vast support network. They lived on alms and the generosity of their patrons. Their daily routine was a bizarre mix of monastic and military life. They spent part of the day in prayer, following a cycle of religious services, just like the monks. But the rest of the day was spent tending to their weapons and horses, training, and above all, fulfilling their mission. In small groups of 2 or 3, they mounted their horses and rode out of the gates of Jerusalem, not to charge gloriously against an army, but to do the tiring and dangerous work of patrolling the roads. They rode slowly along the dusty Jaffa road, scanning the rocky hills for any sign of danger. They met groups of nervous pilgrims who probably looked at them with a mixture of relief and amazement. These strange knights, who asked for no pay, offered to escort them, riding before and behind their party, their swords ready, their eyes constantly moving. It was thankless, repetitive work. Long days in the scorching sun, cold nights sleeping outside. Danger was constant and rarely came in the form of an honorable battle. It came as a sudden ambush from a canyon, an arrow shot from behind a rock. It was police work, not the epic war sung by the troubadours. But for these 9 men, and the few who joined them in the early years, It was a form of sanctity. Every pilgrim who arrived safely in Jerusalem was a victory. Every bandit driven away was a service to God. They were the world's first experience with this new creature, the warrior monk, a man who could sing vespers at night and split a highwayman's skull open the next morning, and see both actions as part of the same sacred calling. They were a walking contradiction, held together by steely faith and crystal clear purpose. There were only 9 of them, then perhaps 12, perhaps 20, a paltry number in the grand scheme of things, but they had a powerful idea, the king's support, and a useful family connection with a certain abbot in France. Their time in obscurity was coming to an end. They needed a proper headquarters, a symbol of their identity, and a much broader approval than a local king and patriarch could give them. The seed planted by Hugo de Payen had taken root, but to grow into the mighty tree that history remembers, it needed richer soil and a brighter light. The name Poor Knights of Christ, and the Temple of Solomon. The little brotherhood of the Poor Knights of Christ now had a sanction, a mission, and a handful of founding members bound together by sacred vows. Yet they lacked something crucial, something that everyone from a king to a baker needs, a place to call home. During their early days, they were virtually homeless. They lived on the charity of the patriarch and the king, temporarily housed in borrowed quarters, their few possessions stored in chests, their horses kept in other people's stables. For an order dedicated to bringing safety and stability to the roads, their very existence was uncomfortably nomadic. They were an institution without an address, an idea without a physical location. King Baldwin II, their pragmatic patron, watched the progress of their little project with interest. He saw the commitment of Hugh de Payen and his companions, saw them setting out early in the morning as the sun rose over the Mount of Olives, and returning at dusk, dusty and exhausted, having spent the day doing the monotonous and dangerous work of escorting pilgrims. Their usefulness was undeniable, but for their small force to grow and become truly effective, they needed more than just goodwill. They needed a base of operations, a headquarters from which they could organize, train, pray, and most important, project an image of permanence and authority. The king had a palace, and it was no ordinary palace. When the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, their leaders established their residence on the city's most imposing and strategically important site, the Temple Mount. This elevated platform, built by Herod the Great on the foundations of the ancient Jewish temple, was a site of immense sanctity to the 3 Abrahamic religions. At its summit gleamed the golden Dome of the Rock, which the Crusaders believed to be the Templum Domini, the Temple of the Lord. And next door stood the magnificent Al-Aqsa Mosque, a vast structure with beautiful arches and a forest of interior columns. The Crusaders, with their somewhat creative understanding of history and archaeology, believed that the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built exactly on the ruins, or even that it was the very remaining structure of King Solomon's temple. This is our widely known historical fact, the cross-identification of the Al-Aqsa Mosque with Solomon's temple. It was in this building, renamed Templum Salomonis, that the king of Jerusalem established his residence and court. It was without doubt the most prestigious address in the entire kingdom, and it was here that Baldwin II made a decision that demonstrates how seriously he took the potential of the new order. He decided, in an unprecedented gesture of generosity and strategic investment, to give an entire wing of his royal palace to this small group of 9 poor knights. Imagine Hugo de Payen's astonishment. He and his brothers, who lived on alms, were suddenly invited to move into the king's palace, not into an annex at the back, but into an integral part of the complex of Solomon's temple. Baldwin II, in effect, moved his own court to the more defensible citadel of the Tower of David, leaving the entire sprawling Templum Salomones complex to its new tenants. It was the medieval equivalent of a billionaire handing over his Beverly Hills mansion to a small non-profit security startup. The message was clear. The king was betting everything on this idea. The move must have been a surreal experience for the knights. They had taken a vow of poverty and were now living on what they considered to be the site of one of the most legendary buildings in history. Their daily routines of prayer and weapons maintenance were now held in rooms that echoed with 1,000 years of history, beneath Islamic arches and mosaics that told stories of a different faith, now reappropriated for Christian purpose. The contrast between their vow of personal poverty and the grandeur of their new headquarters was stark. It was a paradox that would define the order forever. And with a new home came a new name. People in Jerusalem began to refer to them colloquially. They were no longer just the poor knights of Christ. They became those knights who live in the temple. The designation stuck. It was specific, memorable, and incredibly prestigious. Hugh de Payen, realizing the power of this new brand, formalized it. The official name of the order was lengthened, becoming grander, more descriptive. Pauperes Commilitones, Christi Templic Salomonis, the poor companions in arms of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, were now and forever the Knights of the Temple, the Templars. His address had become his identity. His new home was not just a status symbol, it was immensely practical. The vast complex offered more than enough space for dormitories, a dining hall, a chapel, an armory, and training yards. But the most extraordinary feature of their new headquarters was actually underground. This is our marginal historical curiosity. Beneath the vast platform of the Temple Mount was a huge subterranean vaulted structure, built by Herod to support the extension of the esplanade. These vast arched halls, a forest of stone pillars, were known to the Crusaders as Solomon's Stables. The scale of them was breathtaking. They were so large that the Templars, with their engineering expertise, cleared them out and turned them into their own stables. Think about this for a moment. While the knights themselves slept on simple beds in communal dormitories, in keeping with their vow of poverty, their horses were housed in an underground palace. And this was not an unnecessary luxury, it was a strategic necessity. The war horse, the steed, was a knight's most valuable asset, the medieval equivalent of a tank or a fighter jet. Losing a horse in battle meant that a knight became an ineffective infantryman. The Templars, from the beginning, realized that their strength lay in their ability as heavy cavalry. In these vast underground stables, they could house hundreds, eventually thousands of horses. They could breed them, train them, and keep them safe, protected from the scorching summer sun and the cold of winter. The sound of thousands of hooves pounding on the stone floor, the echo of neighs in the vaulted corridors, the smell of hay and horse mingling with the cool dampness of the underground stone. All of this became part of daily life in the temple. The poor Knights of Christ had, without doubt, the most magnificent stables in the entire Christian world. But there is a delightful paradox in the history of this order of contradictions. With a house, a name, and the best stables that money, which they did not individually have, could provide, the Templars began to solidify their reputation. Their presence on the Jaffa Road became more organized and reliable. Groups of pilgrims could now go to the temple in Jerusalem and formally request an escort. The sight of a small detachment of horsemen, dressed in patched armor and simple overcoats, emerging from the gates of Solomon's legendary temple to protect them, must have been a source of immense comfort and awe. They became an integral part of the landscape of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They were the monks who did not hide behind monastery walls, but who patrolled the frontiers of the faith. They were the warriors whose battle was not for land or glory, but for the safety of a wool merchant in Flanders or a pious widow in Tuscany. However, Hugh de Payens was a man of vision. He knew that for his order to survive and prosper, local approval, however generous, was not enough. The support of the King of Jerusalem was vital, but kings could die or change their minds. The local patriarch could be replaced to become a truly permanent and powerful institution. His order needed the highest possible sanction. It needed the seal of approval of the Pope himself and the recognition of the entire Catholic Church. He needed an official rule that would define his way of life, and he desperately needed new recruits, and most importantly, a steady stream of donations to fund his expensive operations. The base in Jerusalem was secure. The mission was underway. Now was the time to look west. It was time to take his radical idea back to Europe and sell it to the hearts, minds, and crucially, the pockets of Christendom. Hugo de Payens, the humble knight of Champagne, was about to embark on the most important recruitment drive in history. His trip to Europe would seal the fate of his small brotherhood, transforming it from a local experiment in the Holy Land into one of the richest and most powerful multinational corporations the world has ever seen. The startup phase was over. The expansion phase was about to begin. First escort missions. The grandeur of their new headquarters, the legendary Temple of Solomon, might have gone to the heads of lesser men. They might have strutted about their halls, lost in dreams of grandeur, already feeling like princes of the church. But Hugh de Payens and his brothers were not lesser men. They were men with a mission, and that mission was not in the cool, shadowy corridors of their palace, but out there, under the relentless sun, on the dusty, dangerous roads that led to Jerusalem. Their new home was a means to an end, not the end itself. Their true calling, their sacred work, began each day at dawn, with the creak of the gate's hinges and the sound of horses' hooves in the courtyard. Imagine a typical morning for this nascent brotherhood. Even before the first ray of sunlight gilded the dome of the rock, the knights were on their feet. Their first duty was to God. In a corner of the vast complex they had adapted as a chapel, their voices, more accustomed to shouting orders than to chanting psalms, recited morning prayers. It was a scene of profound contrasts. Men, whose hands were calloused by the hilt of their swords, now joined in prayer. Strong bodies trained for violence, kneeling in submission before the altar. After prayers came the soldiers' routine. A frugal breakfast of bread and perhaps a little cheese, eaten in silence in the mess hall. Then came the ritual of arming oneself. In those early years, they did not yet have their iconic white coat. That was a distinction that would come later. For now, their appearance was a functional patchwork. They wore their own armor, probably brought from Europe, now worn and patched. Over their chainmail they wore simple overcoats of various colors to protect the metal from the scorching sun. They were not the immaculate knights of legend. They were practical soldiers, dressed for work. The mission for the day was simple: to escort a group of pilgrims who had arrived in Jaffa and traveled part of the way, now waiting for protection at an agreed meeting point. 2 or 3 knights, accompanied by their squires, were descending into Solomon's vast stables. The subterranean air was cool and heavy, with the smell of hay, leather, and animal flesh. They readied their horses, checking the saddles, tightening the straps, the sound of creaking leather and clanking metal echoing through the vaulted halls. Then, mounted on their imposing steeds, they emerged into the daylight, a vision of silent purpose, and rode out of the city. Their destination was the road, their open-air office, and it was a dangerous office. The road from Jaffa to Jerusalem was, as we have seen, notoriously treacherous. But the danger was not uniform. There were specific points where the risk was greatest. The most famous of these points was a gorge known as Bab el-Wad in Arabic or Shahar Haggai in Hebrew, the gate of the valley. This narrow pass, with steep hills on either side, was the perfect place for an ambush. This is our widely known historical costume. The notorious Jaffa-Jerusalem road and its dangerous gorges, a problem that persisted for centuries. For pilgrims, approaching a place like this was a moment of pure terror. Every shadow, every rock, seemed to hide an enemy. This is where the Templars came in. Their task was not just to fight, but more importantly, to deter. The sight of two armed knights seated on their massive war horses was often enough to make a band of brigands think twice. It wasn't worth the risk. The easy prey had suddenly developed steel teeth. Let's imagine one such encounter. A small group of pilgrims, perhaps a merchant of Pisa with his family, a monk from Germany, and some French peasants who have sold everything for the journey, are camped nervously near a spring. They hear the sound of hooves and their hearts sink. But instead of bandits, two knights of the temple appear. Their appearance is austere, their faces impenetrable, but their presence is like that of guardian angels. Communication is minimal. The Templars were not known for their sharp conversation. A nod, perhaps a short question in rudimentary French or Latin. The message was clear. Follow us, stay together, don't stray. And the little caravan formed. One horseman in front, the other in the rear, the pilgrims and their pack mules in the middle. And here we discover our marginal historical curiosity. The Templars' role went far beyond that of mere bodyguards. They were, in essence, the world's first armed tour guides. Their constant patrolling of the same routes gave them an intimate knowledge of the terrain that no pilgrim could have. They weren't just protecting, they were guiding. They knew that a particular spring was safe to drink from, while the one a few miles away was often contaminated. They knew that a certain olive grove offered a good camping spot, with cover and defensible terrain, while the next valley over was a natural trap. As the caravan moved slowly under the sun, one of the horsemen might aim his lance at a distant ruin on a hill. Emmaus, he might say, and nothing more. But to the pilgrims, that single word was electrifying. This was the place where the risen Christ had appeared to two of his disciples. The landscape, which had previously been a blur of danger and dust, suddenly came alive with the holiness of their faith. The Templar was not only guiding them through dangerous territory, he was guiding them through the pages of the Bible. This combination of military protection and logistical and topographical knowledge was their true value. They transformed a terrifying ordeal into a viable and sometimes even inspiring pilgrimage. The day dragged on. The heat was a physical presence. The chalky dust kicked up by the mules and horses covered everything in a thin white layer. The sound was that of slow walking, the buzzing of flies, the occasional cry of a tired child, and the constant clink of the rider's equipment. Tension was a constant companion. At a narrow passage, the lead rider would raise his hand, and the caravan would stop. The silence was absolute. broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. The horsemen scanned the ridges, their eyes trained on the slightest sign of movement, the glint of metal in the sun. The pilgrims held their breath, their hearts pounding wildly. After a minute that seemed like an eternity, the knight lowered his hand and the caravan continued on. Nothing happened, but the threat was always there, an invisible predator in the landscape. Night brought some relief from the heat, but not from the danger. The group camped in a place chosen by the Templars, while the pilgrims took care of their needs, setting up rudimentary tents and preparing a simple meal. The knights did not rest. One kept watch, walking slowly around the perimeter of the camp, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. The other looked after the horses, for without them, the mission would fail. They ate separately, their simple food reinforcing their vow of poverty. They were a presence at once comforting and intimidating. They were with the pilgrims, but they were not one of them. Their dedication set them apart, placed them on a different plane of existence. There was, no doubt, a touch of ironic humor in the situation. Knights from noble families spending their nights guarding a merchant who complained of discomfort, all in the name of God. Holiness is rarely glamorous. Finally, after 2 or 3 days of this slow, tense procession, the moment of reward arrived. The road climbed one last hill, and there, in the distance, bathed in afternoon light, was Jerusalem. The walls, the towers, the golden glow of the dome of the rock. For the pilgrims, it was the culmination of a lifelong dream. They fell to their knees, weeping, praying, embracing one another. It was a moment of pure ecstasy, the reward for all the sacrifices and fears. Templar rivers. The chronicles do not tell us what they felt, but we can imagine. Not the same ecstatic joy of the pilgrims, perhaps a quiet, austere satisfaction, the feeling of a job well done. They had fulfilled their vow. They had delivered their precious cargo safely. Their task was complete. They accompanied the exultant party to the city gates, and then, without fanfare, parted company, leading their weary horses back to their headquarters at the temple. Upon their return, the cycle began again. Groom the horses, clean and repair equipment, pray at vespers, sleep an exhausting sleep, and be ready to do it all again the next day. This was the life of the early Templars. It was not a life of epic battles or the pursuit of the holy degree. It was a routine of sacred police work, a cycle of danger, boredom, and duty. But each pilgrim who arrived safely was a small victory, a justification for their existence, a brick in the foundation of their growing legend. Their fame was built not on a single glorious battle, but on hundreds of dusty, successful journeys through the valley gate. They were proving their worth, not with words, but with the quiet reliability of their sword and their knowledge. Installation on the grounds of the ancient Temple of Solomon. And so, at the end of another dusty day, the knights guided their tired horses through the bustling gates of Jerusalem. They left behind the noise, the chaos of the market, the greetings and curious glances, and headed home. But their home was not a rugged fortress or an austere barracks on the outskirts of the city. They were climbing the ramp that led to the vast, sacred terrace of the Temple Mount. The air here felt different, but thin, heavy with the weight of millennia of prayer, conflict, and longing. As they passed beneath the arches that overlooked their new headquarters, the sound of the horses' hooves changed, from the dull thud of the earth to a sharp, resonant click on time-honored stone slabs. They had arrived at the Templum Salomonis. They had arrived at home. King Baldwin II's decision to grant him this prime property was not just an act of generosity, it was a statement. The king was investing political and symbolic capital in this small order. By handing them the keys to his own palace, he was elevating them from a group of well-meaning vigilantes to an institution central to the defense and identity of the kingdom. But being given a palace and living in a palace are two very different things, especially when you have taken a vow of poverty. The wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque that they were given was not a blank canvas. It had been a royal residence with its own rooms, decorations, and history. The knight's first task was one of adaptation and purification. They were not princes to revel in ornate recessional rooms. They were monks and soldiers. They needed functionality, simplicity, and order. The installation process was a labor of love and sweat, an act of transformation of space that reflected his own inner transformation. Rooms that once echoed with courtly conversation and lute music were emptied. Luxurious furnishings were removed. Tapestries and silk cushions, if any, were dispensed with. Their place was taken by the brutal simplicity of monastic and military life. A long, airy room with arched windows, which had perhaps been a banqueting hall, was transformed into their common bedroom. There were no private rooms. Simple straw mattresses covered with a rough woolen sheet were lined up on the stone floor, each at a regulation distance from the other. The only personal furniture permitted was a small chest for his spare robe and his prayer books. They all slept together, the nobles of high birth alongside the knights of humbler origins. Their snoring joined together in a chorus that erased all class distinctions from the world they had left behind. Another large room became their dining hall. Here the paradox of their existence was most visible. They ate their simple meals, often just a stew of vegetables, bread and water, as meat was a luxury reserved for a few days a week, at long tables of rough wood, seated on benches without backs. But as they ate in silence, listening to a brother read passages from the Bible, their eyes could wander to the walls. They could see the remains of intricate mosaics, the delicate work of Islamic craftsmen from centuries past, or the marble columns that supported the vaulted ceiling. It was a life of deliberate personal deprivation, lived amid borrowed architectural grandeur. There was a certain irony, a dry humor, that was probably not lost on these men as they munched their hard bread while surrounded by beauty that would make a king sigh. Of course, their new home was, above all, the headquarters of a military order. The central courtyard, once perhaps a quiet garden with a fountain, was quickly converted into a training ground. The soft sound of running water was replaced by the rhythmic clash of wooden swords, the metallic sound of steel being sharpened on the anvil, and the shouts of men practicing their maneuvers on horseback. Here they honed their skills, not unjustly for the glory of a lady, but in practical exercises for survival on the road and for warfare in the open field. But the most fascinating and mysterious aspect of their installation was not in plain sight. It was beneath their feet. In receiving Solomon's temple, they became the guardians of one of the most sensitive archaeological sites in the world. This is our widely known historical costume. By settling on the Temple Mount, the Templars became inextricably linked to the legend of Solomon's Temple. This association was the greatest marketing campaign of the Middle Ages. They were not just knights, they were the knights of the temple. The name conjured up images of holiness, mystery, and ancient power, giving them an aura that no other military order possessed. And this leads us directly to our fringe historical curiosity, the seed of countless conspiracy theories and adventure novels. there is strong evidence that the Templars did more than just live on the Temple Mount. They dug. The contemporary chronicler William of Tyre, who was not a great fan of the Templars and saw them as arrogant and secretive, mentions in passing the vast underground structures of the complex. During the 19th century, a team of British Royal Engineers exploring the Temple Mount found intriguing evidence. They discovered tunnels that did not appear to date from the time of Herod or the Islamic periods. In one of these tunnels, they found typical Templar artifacts, such as spurs and fragments of a cross. In a deep cistern below the mosque site, they found Templar crosses crudely carved into the stone walls. What were they doing? The official, and probably most practical explanation, is that they were simply cleaning and exploring their new property. They were clearing out the underground stables, searching for stable water sources in the cisterns, and ensuring the structural integrity of the site. It was a matter of facilities management, but the imagination, then as now, runs wild. Were they undertaking the first archaeological dig in the Holy Land, motivated by pious curiosity? Or were they, as legend has it, searching for something more? The lost treasure of Solomon's Temple, secret documents dating back to the time of Christ, or most tantalizing of all, the supreme relic, the Ark of the Covenant, believed to have been housed in the Holy of Holies of the original temple. We will never know for sure. The Templars were a notoriously secretive order, and if they found anything, they didn't tell the world. But the very fact that they had the exclusive opportunity, for nearly a decade, to dig at Judaism's most sacred and mysterious site, unsupervised, fueled a legend that became bigger than the order itself. They may have looked for only water and found only dust, but to the outside world, they were the keepers of ancient secrets, men who literally lived on top of history. This new house and its growing reputation transformed them from a local experience to an institution. Pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem gazed with reverence at the temple terrace, knowing that up there in those sacred buildings lived the warrior monks who had protected them on the road. Their moral and military authority grew exponentially. They established a routine, a schedule, that balanced the demands of monastic life with those of military life. The day was punctuated by the ringing of a bell, calling them to prayer, to meals, to training, or to chapter. The formal meeting where the business of the order was discussed, infractions disciplined, and missions assigned. They had created a self-sufficient society within the temple walls, with their own blacksmiths to forge weapons, their own cooks, their own clergy to perform religious services. They were building not just a fighting force, but a culture of discipline, devotion, and singular purpose. The individual knight was anonymous, his identity submerged in that of the brotherhood. But the brotherhood itself was becoming famous. Their installation in Solomon's temple was therefore much more than a simple change of address. It was the moment when the order gained its soul, its identity, and its mystery. It was the crucible where Hugo de Payen's ideal was forged into an enduring reality. They were now firmly rooted, literally and figuratively, in the heart of Jerusalem. But Hugo, the visionary, knew that roots, however deep, needed rain to flourish. And the rain, in the form of recruits, donations, and above all, the papal blessing, was in Europe. With his base secure, his brand established, and his operations running smoothly, it was time for the master of the order to take a trip. It was time to go home and show Christendom what their little seed had become. The support of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Royalty and the new order lived in a strange, silent symbiosis, sharing the same ancient courtyards and breathing the same air laden with history. King Baldwin II was not only a generous landlord, he was a thoughtful investor and a curious neighbor. From his new residence in the Tower of David, he could look out over the Temple Mount and see his venture taking shape. He could see the small figures of knights practicing in the courtyard, hear the distant sound of his bell calling to prayer. And most important, he got the reports. Reports of fewer ambushes on the Jaffa Road, reports of pilgrim caravans arriving intact, with stories not of terror, but of admiration for these silent, efficient guardians. Baldwin's support went far beyond a roof over his head. It manifested itself in subtle and crucial ways. When the Templars' provisions ran dangerously low, a surplus of grain from the royal storehouses would mysteriously find its way to the temple kitchen. When a warhorse died in battle, a suitable replacement was found in the king's stables. And perhaps most important, Baldwin offered them his political shield. At the court in Jerusalem, a hotbed of proud and ambitious nobles, the rise of a new group favored by the king could easily have generated jealousy and resentment. But the monarch's unequivocal approval silenced most criticism. No one dared openly challenge the king's protégés, especially when those protégés carried swords and looked as though they would not hesitate to use them. But why such fervent support? Baldwin was no mystical dreamer. He was a hardened soldier, a pragmatic politician who had spent most of his adult life struggling to hold together a kingdom that seemed constantly falling apart. His life was a perpetual crisis. Their support for the Templars was not an act of charity. It was a brilliant strategic calculation born of the harshest of necessities. The Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states, such as the County of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch, were demographic islands. They were ruled by a small elite of Franks over a diverse local population of Eastern Christians, Muslims and Jews, most of whom had no loyalty to their new overlords. They were surrounded by enemies who overwhelmingly outnumbered them. Maintaining an army in the field was a logistical and financial nightmare. Feudal armies were composed of knights who owed the king a limited military service, usually 40 days per year. After that, they had the right to return to take care of their own lands and affairs. This meant that the king could only rely on his full force for short periods. The rest of the time, he had to make do with a minimal garrison and expensive and not always reliable mercenaries. The most severe test of this weakness, the event which undoubtedly cemented in Baldwin's mind the absolute necessity of a permanent and loyal fighting force, came in the year 1123. This is our widely known historical fact, the capture of King Baldwin II himself. While patrolling the frontier near Edessa, the king was ambushed by a Turkish force under the command of the Artukad emir Balak Gazi. Baldwin, the anointed king of Jerusalem, was taken in chains to the fortress of Karput. The kingdom was suddenly left leaderless. It was a disaster of epic proportions that left the Crusader states panicked and vulnerable. He remained captive for over a year, only to be released after a colossal ransom was paid and territories were ceded. This humiliating and terrifying experience must have been a brutal lesson. A king could not be everywhere at once. The feudal structure was ill-suited to the constant low-intensity warfare and sudden threats his kingdom faced. And it was here that he saw the true genius of Hugh de Payen's idea. The Templars were not bound to a 40-day service. Their service was for life. Their loyalty was not to a fiefdom in Normandy, but to the Holy Land and its order. They were full-time professionals, a rapid reaction force that was always available. They were the solution to Baldwin's most fundamental problem. By supporting the Templars, he was not just protecting pilgrims. He was cultivating the nucleus of Christendom's first standing professional army since the fall of Rome. It was a long-term investment in the very survival of his kingdom. In addition to his military prowess, Baldwin was a surprisingly pragmatic and innovative man when it came to his own household, which is what our marginal historical curiosity tells us. The king had no sons, a serious problem in a feudal world obsessed with male succession. Rather than despair, he and his wife, the Armenian Queen Morphia of Melitene, raised their 4 daughters to be rulers. Their eldest daughter, Melisenda, was not only married off to a European nobleman, Fulk of Anjou, so that he could assume control. In a remarkable and almost unprecedented political move, Baldwin insisted that Melisenda be crowned not as a queen consort, but as a queen regnant, with power equal to that of her husband. Before he died, he had his nobles swear allegiance to both Fulk and Melisenda and their infant son. A man who could conceive of a joint monarchy and secure his daughter's succession rights in such a patriarchal environment was clearly a man capable of thinking outside the box. His support for such a radical idea as an order of warrior monks fits perfectly with his profile as an innovative and pragmatic leader. He knew a good idea when he saw one, no matter how strange it seemed. As time passed, the relationship between the king and the master of the order deepened. Baldwin and Hugh de Payens were both middle-aged men, veterans of countless battles, both carrying the weight of enormous responsibilities. We can imagine them having quiet conversations, out of earshot of the court, perhaps at the end of the day walking through the temple courts as the sky turned orange and purple. Baldwin the king sharing his concerns about threats from Damascus or Egypt. Hugh the master recounting the needs of his growing order. More men, better equipment, more horses. It was in one of these conversations that the next phase of the plan must have been hatched. Both men came to the same conclusion. The experiment in Jerusalem had been a resounding success, a working prototype. But to move from the prototype stage to mass production, they needed an investment that the Kingdom of Jerusalem alone could not provide. They needed the full approval of the church, not just the local patriarch. They needed a written, sanctioned rule that would give them canonical legitimacy, and they desperately needed access to Europe's vast reservoir of wealth and idealistic young nobles. "Go west, Hugo," we can imagine Baldwin saying, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Go and tell our story. Tell the Pope what we are doing here. Tell the dukes and counts. Show them the work your brothers are doing to protect the road to Christ's tomb." This was not a suggestion. It was a royal order, a diplomatic mission of the highest importance. And Baldwin did not send them away empty-handed. He prepared the way. Official letters sealed with the royal seal of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were drawn up. They were letters of recommendation, addressed to Pope Honorius II and to all the secular and ecclesiastical princes of Europe. In the letters, Baldwin praised the work of the poor knights, describing their bravery, their piety, and, above all, their indispensable usefulness. He asked his brother rulers and the leaders of the church to receive Hugh de Payens and his delegation with honor, and to hear his appeal with a generous heart. The king was using all his prestige as ruler of the holiest kingdom in Christendom to support the fundraising and recruitment campaign of his favorite order. He understood that by strengthening the Templars, he was strengthening himself. By securing their future, he was securing the future of his own kingdom. It was the culmination of their support, an act of patronage that would transform the tiny Order of Jerusalem into an international powerhouse. And so, Around the year 1127, nearly a decade after its founding, a small delegation prepared for the long sea voyage back to Europe. Led by Hugh of Payens, now a diplomat and lobbyist as much as a soldier, the group included some of its founding knights. They were not going as humble pilgrims, but as emissaries of the King of Jerusalem, carrying letters that were keys to unlocking the most important gates in Europe. As they set out, Baldwin II must have watched them from the top of the city walls, a solitary figure gazing out to sea. He was sending some of his best men away, but he knew it was a necessary risk. He was sending a seed back to the fertile soil from which it came, in the hope that it would return as a forest, the role of Bernard of Clairvaux. The return trip to Europe was a reversal of the original crusade journey. The Genoese or Venetian ship, with its heaving decks, was not taking men to an unknown and dusty east, but bringing them back to a familiar but now strange west. For Hugo de Payens and his companions, who had spent nearly 30 years under the relentless sun and arid landscape of the Holy Land, returning to Europe must have been a sensory shock. As they sailed north, the salty, humid Mediterranean air grew colder. The blinding blue of the Levantine sky gave way to a paler blue, often veiled by clouds, and when they finally landed, probably in the south of France, the first thing that must have hit them was the smell, the rich scent of damp earth and oak forests and impending rain, and the colour. After years of living in a palette of ochres, browns and golds, the lush, misty green of France must have seemed almost painfully intense. They were home, but they were now men of two worlds, their hearts and minds forever divided between the landscape of their youth and the sacred land they had sworn to protect. The Templar delegation wasted no time on sentimentality. They had a mission. Armed with the letters of King Baldwin II, they began their campaign. They travelled through France, from Aquitaine to Anjou, from Flanders to Normandy, and even to England. In every court, in every castle, in every abbey, Hugh de Payens told his story. He was not a polished orator, trained in the arts of rhetoric. He was a soldier. His eloquence came from his sincerity. In a stern voice, he described the reality of life in the Holy Land. Not the glorious battles, but the daily, dangerous work of protecting pilgrims. He spoke of ordinary men and women who had travelled thousands of miles out of devotion, only to be slaughtered just days from their destination, and then he presented his solution. A brotherhood of men who had given up everything to dedicate themselves to this sacred cause. His message found a receptive audience. Europe was fascinated by the Holy Land. The First Crusade was already a legend, sung in songs and told by the voice. The idea of knights fighting for Christ in the place where he walked was immensely powerful. Donations began to arrive. Nobles, moved by piety, or perhaps by a pang of guilt for not having gone on crusade themselves, donated land, money, horses. Young sons of noble families, with no inheritance of their own, and in search of purpose, were drawn to the idea of a life of sacred adventure. But Hugo knew that donations and recruits, however welcome, were not the end goal. They were just the beginning. To secure the future of his order, he needed the sanction of the most powerful authority in Europe. And that authority was not a king or an emperor. He was a monk, a thin, austere, and terribly intelligent monk named Bernard, the abbot of Clairvaux. In the power landscape of the early 12th century, Bernard of Clairvaux was a giant. He had neither armies nor a secular title. His strength was purely moral and intellectual, but his impact was profoundly political. He was a Cistercian monk, an order that advocated a return to a purer, more austere form of Benedictine monasticism, while other orders, such as the Cluniacs, had become wealthy and their monasteries had become glorious works of art. The Cistercians sought simplicity, manual labor, and isolation. But Bernard could not remain isolated. His brilliant mind, his spiritual fervor, and his gift for writing and oratory drew him to the center of all the great debates of his time. He was an advisor to popes, a mediator in disputes between kings, a relentless hunter of heresies, and an arbiter of European spiritual taste. His opinion could make or break an ecclesiastical career, legitimize a king, or, as was later to happen, launch an entire crusade. This is our widely known historical fact, the role of Bernard of Clairvaux as the chief preacher and promoter of the Second Crusade, an achievement that demonstrates his immense influence on the European mind. If Bernard could convince tens of thousands of men to leave their homes to fight in a war thousands of miles away, he could certainly convince the Church to approve a small order of 9 knights. Hugh de Payens knew this, and he had an advantage. One of his founding knights, Andrew of Montbard, was Bernard's uncle. The family connection was his gateway. Hugo went to the monastery of Clairvaux, a remote valley in Morgana. The contrast with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem could not be greater. There were no golden domes or glittering mosaics. Clairvaux Abbey was a collection of stone and wood buildings, deliberately simple and devoid of ornamentation. The silence was profound, broken only by the chanting of the monks, the wind in the trees, and the sound of manual labor. Here we find our marginal historical curiosity, Bernard's deep aversion to all that he considered to be luxury and distraction in religious life, especially in art and architecture. He wrote a famous diatribe against the opulence of the Cluniac churches, ridiculing what he saw as monstrous waste. He asked with cutting sarcasm, "What use are those ridiculous monstrosities, those filthy apes, those ferocious lions, those monstrous centaurs, in the cloisters before the eyes of the brethren who read? For God's sake, if we are not ashamed of these absurdities, why don't we at least regret the expense?" This was the man Hugo de Payens had to convince, a spiritual minimalist, a purist who believed that true faith was found in simplicity and contemplation, not in the glitter of gold or the complexity of art. The irony of asking this man to approve a military order that required the most expensive equipment of the time and that would become one of the richest organizations in the world is simply delicious. The meeting between the two men must have been fascinating. Hugo, the pragmatic soldier, the man of action, with his skin tanned by the desert sun. Bernardo, the ascetic intellectual, pale and thin from his constant fasting, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. Hugo presented his case. He did not speak only of the need to protect pilgrims. He presented the order of the temple as a new form of chivalry, a new militia, a way to channel the violent energy of the noble class, which would otherwise be spent on sinful private wars, into a sacred purpose. He offered Bernard a solution to a problem that Bernard himself had often lamented, the sinfulness and vanity of secular knights. Bernard listened, and the idea resonated with him. He who preached renunciation of the world saw in the Templars a way to sanctify the world. A knight who took a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience was not an ordinary knight. He was a weapon in the hands of God. His violence was not a sin, but an act of justice, a necessary evil to protect the good. He saw the theological logic, the paradoxical beauty of a malicide, not a homicide, but the killing of evil. Bernard not only approved of the idea, he embraced it with all the fervour of his overwhelming personality. He became the Templars' greatest champion. From his cold cell in Clairvaux, he launched a lobbying campaign that would make any modern political operator blush. His letters began to fly all over Europe, addressed to bishops, cardinals and nobles. With his elegant and powerful prose, he sang the praises of this new chivalry. Most importantly, he wrote his masterpiece of propaganda and theology on their behalf, a treatise called Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new chivalry. This little book was the theological Magna Carta of the Templars, the document that justified them before the entire Christian world. In it, Bernardo creates a dramatic contrast. On one side is the secular knight, who fights for vanity, greed, and earthly glory. His clothes are made of silk, his weapons inlaid with gold and silver. His hair is long. He is a sinner, in danger of eternal damnation with every battle. On the other side is the Knight of Christ, the Templar. He is austere, disciplined. He despises luxury. He fights not for himself, but for Christ. He is indeed fearless, writes Bernard, and secure on all sides, for his soul is protected by the armour of faith. Just as his body is protected by the armour of steel, he is therefore doubly armed, and need fear neither demons nor men. And then he addresses the central issue, the killing. The Knight of Christ, Bernard argues, can strike with confidence and die with even greater confidence, for he serves Christ when he strikes and wins Christ for himself when he falls. When he inflicts death, it is for Christ's sake, and when he suffers it, it is for his own gain. The Christian glories in the death of a pagan, because Christ is glorified. These words, shocking to modern sensibilities, were music to the ears of a militant and devout Europe. Bernard had given the Templars their theological justification. He had transformed his soldiers into potential martyrs, their acts of violence into acts of faith. With Bernard of Clairvaux as his advocate, the success of Hugh of Payen's mission was virtually assured. He was no longer merely an emissary from the distant king of Jerusalem. He was now the protégé of the holiest and most influential man in Europe. His small order of warrior monks had found its prophet. Bernard had prepared the ground, convinced the important people, and ensured that when the question of official approval for the order was raised at a church council, the answer would be a resounding yes. The seed planted in Jerusalem and watered with the support of a king was now being bathed in the brightest light in Christendom. The stage was set for the official and glorious birth of the Order of the Temple, the Council of Troyes, and the official approval of the order. Winter had arrived in Europe, a crisp, cold winter that covered the fields of Champagne with a thin layer of frost and turned the warm breath of the horses into clouds of steam. For Hugo de Payens and his small delegation, the cold was an old acquaintance, but different from the dry chill of the nights in the Judean desert. This was a damp chill that seeped into the bones, a chill that smelled of burning hearths and sleeping earth, and it was toward the heart of this winter, toward the prosperous city of Troyes, the capital of Champagne and Hugo's hometown, that all the threads of his diplomacy, his faith, and his hopes now converged. The city of Troyes in January of the year 1129 was bustling with unusual excitement. Its narrow, muddy streets were clogged not only with the usual merchants and artisans, but with the retinues of the most powerful men in the church in France. Bishops in their silken robes, archbishops with their retinues of clergy, and abbots of important monasteries, all converged on the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul. The air inside the cathedral, a structure still under construction, but already imposing, was a potent mix of beeswax, incense, and the damp wool smell of hundreds of robes. Pope Honorius II was not present in person, but his papal legate, Cardinal Matthew of Albano, was, and his presence meant that decisions made here would carry the weight of Rome's authority. This impressive assembly of ecclesiastical power had not gathered to debate an obscure point of doctrine or to judge an errant bishop. They had been summoned for a very specific reason. They had come to hear the proposal of a middle-aged, sun-beaten knight and to decide the fate of their strange brotherhood. They were there to judge the order of the temple. For Hugo de Payens, entering that cathedral must have been the most intimidating moment of his life. More intimidating than facing a Turkish cavalry charge, more intimidating than an ambush in a gorge. Here he was not a warrior in his element, but a petitioner before judges whose weapons were theology and canon law. He and his companions, with their simple clothes and their faces scarred by war and time, seemed out of place amid the opulence and learning of that assembly. They were men of action in a world of words. But Hugh was not alone. Sitting among the abbots was his trump card, his champion, Bernard of Clairvaux, thin, pale, but with a presence that seemed to fill the room. Bernard was there to ensure that his new knighthood got what it deserved. The stage was set. The Council of Troyes had begun. This is our widely known historical fact. The Council of Troy, in 1129, was convened specifically to recognize and establish a rule for the order of the temple. The cardinal legate opened the proceedings, and then the floor was given to Hugh of Payens. With a firm voice, he rose and spoke. He repeated the story he had told in so many courts and abbeys. The story of the founding of the order, the desperate need to protect pilgrims, the support of King Baldwin, the installation in Solomon's temple. He described their daily routine, the mixture of prayer and patrol, of monastic life and military duty. And then he made his request. He asked the council to officially recognize his order, to give them a formal place within the church structure, and, crucially, he asked them to help him draw up a rule, a code of conduct that would govern every aspect of a knight's life, from the way he prayed to the way he fought. After Hugh's speech, the debate began, and it was by no means a foregone conclusion. Despite Bernard's lobbying, many of the prelates present had serious reservations. The idea was still deeply radical. One older bishop might have raised his hand. "Venerable brothers, your voice echoing in the stone nave. What we are being asked to do here is to sanction a contradiction. Since the days of the Church Fathers, we have been taught that the man of God does not shed blood. So how can we, as shepherds of Christ's flock, bless an order of monks whose office is the sword?" Another, more pragmatic, voiced jurisdictional concerns. If this order is approved, to whom will they answer? To the local bishops in whose dioceses they operate, or directly to the Pope? Are we creating a private militia beyond our control? These were valid objections, rooted in centuries of tradition and very real concerns about power and authority. The future of the order hung in the balance. It was then that Bernard of Clairvaux rose to speak. The murmur in the cathedral ceased. All eyes turned to him, and Bernardo, with his hypnotic voice and razor-sharp logic, dismantled every objection. He did not speak like a lawyer defending a client. He spoke as a prophet revealing divine truth. He took up the objection about violence. "Our temple brothers are not murderers," he declared. "Their voice fills the space. They are malicious, killers of evil. Their sword is not lifted against men, but against iniquity. They are Christ's avengers against evildoers." He transformed their violence from a sin into a virtue, from a transgression into a form of sacred justice. He addressed the issue of newness, arguing that times change and that God inspires new solutions to new problems. Threatened by enemies, Christianity needed new defenders. The temple order was not a corruption of the monastic ideal, but its fulfillment in an age of conflict. It was God's answer to the crisis of the age. He spoke for a long time, his passion and conviction sweeping the room. He painted such a vivid and heroic picture of the Templars that the knights sitting there, practical men who worried about horseshoes and food rations, must have looked at each other in some astonishment, wondering if he was really talking about them by the time Bernard sat down. The mood in the room had changed. Doubts had been replaced by enthusiasm. Objections now seemed petty and faithless. The battle had been won. The council voted overwhelmingly in favor of recognizing the order. It was a moment of total triumph for Hugh de Payens. His little brotherhood, born from the dust and danger of the Jaffa Road, was now an official and approved order of the Holy Catholic Church. Their actions, their way of life, their very existence were now legitimized at the highest level. With approval secured, the council moved on to its second task, the drafting of the Templar rule. Bernard of Clairvaux, as the brains behind it all, played a central role, but it was a collaborative effort. And it is here, in the details of this new rule, that we find our marginal historical curiosity, which reveals much about the mentality of the time. The rule was not just concerned with grand questions of theology and warfare. It was obsessively detailed about everyday life, especially about appearance. In an effort to distinguish the Templars from the vain secular knights that Bernard so despised, the rule prohibited extravagant fashions. Specifically, it prohibited pointy shoes, rostrata, and shoelaces, which were the height of aristocratic fashion at the time. And in a touch that would become iconic, the rule addressed hair and beards. The Templars were required to keep their hair short, so that it would not obstruct their vision, but they were encouraged to wear a beard. A beard, unlike long hair and pointed shoes, was seen as a sign of virile masculinity and seriousness, distinguishing them from the clean-shaven clergy and effeminate nobles. The result was the creation of an instantly recognizable Templar look. Short hair, full beard, simple clothes, and of course, absolutely no pointy shoes. Holiness began, it seemed, at the feet. The rule, with its initial 72 articles, covered everything: diet, meat 3 times a week to maintain strength, prayer times, silence during meals, a ban on hunting except lions, which was seen as a personification of the devil and conveniently abounded in the Holy Land, and strict discipline. Any infraction could be punished by fasting, extra work, or, for serious offences, public flogging or even expulsion from the order. The Council of Troyes was the true moment of the birth of the Temple Order as a power. They emerged from that winter cathedral not only with the Pope's approval, but with a codified identity, a rule to live by, and a theological justification from the most respected man in Europe. Hugh de Payens had come to Troyes as the leader of a small experimental group. He left as the Grand Master of a church order, with a future as bright as the dome of the temple they called home. The recruitment and fundraising campaign exploded. With the papal seal of approval and the endorsement of Bernard of Clairvaux, being a Templar or donating to the Templars became the fashionable way to be pious. The way was now clear for massive expansion, for the creation of a network of commanderies across Europe, and for the establishment of the order as one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in the medieval world. The work at Troas was done. Now it was time to build the empire. The drafting of the Templar rule. The jubilation in Troy Cathedral was brief, quickly replaced by an atmosphere of intense, focused work. Approval was the thunder. Now came the painstaking task of capturing the lightning in a bottle. The creation of a monastic rule was not an exercise in creative writing. It was an act of spiritual and legal engineering, the drafting of a constitution for a new nation of souls. The council formed a small working committee. It was a fascinating group, a mix of men whose life experiences could not have been more different. On one side were the ecclesiastics, men like the papal legate himself and other bishops and abbots, whose lives were governed by the rhythm of Latin, the logic of canon law, and the subtlety of theology. Their hands were soft, accustomed to turning the delicate pages of manuscripts and holding the chalice. On the other side stood Hugh de Payon, whose hands were calloused by the hilt of his sword and the reins of his horse. He was the expert on practical matters, the voice of battlefield reality, and presiding over it all, the chief architect, was Bernard of Clairvaux. He was the bridge between these two worlds. With his brilliant mind, he could take a brutally practical military necessity expressed by Hugo and clothe it in such beautiful theological language and such solid canonical justification that it became not only acceptable but divinely inspired. Imagine them sitting in a side room of the cathedral, the cold seeping through the cracks in the stained glass windows, a large oak table covered with sheets of virgin parchment, pots of black ink, and freshly trimmed goose feathers. The sound in the room was the scraping of chairs, the clearing of throats, the murmuring of Latin, and above all the rhythmic steady scratching of quills on parchment, a dry whispering sound like a winter wind through dry reeds. The starting point, the model for the new rule, was not invented out of thin air. They built upon the foundation of all Western monasticism. This is our widely known historical fact. The Templar rule, known as the Latin rule, was heavily based on the rule of Saint Benedict as interpreted and practiced by the Cistercian order of Bernard. It was, in essence, the Cistercian rule, adapted for men who carried swords instead of hoes. Bernardo took his own ideal of simplicity, prayer, obedience, and community service and asked, "How does this work for a soldier?" The answer was a masterpiece of adaptation. The document that emerged, with its initial 72 articles, was a detailed instruction manual for building a new kind of man. It began with the essentials, the structure of command. At the top was the master of the order. Later, the Grand Master, who had almost absolute authority, but who had to consult the chapter of knights before making important decisions, such as declaring war or donating lands to the order. Below him were the seneschal, his second in command, and the marshal, the military chief, responsible for all horses, weapons, and equipment. This clear hierarchy was essential to military discipline. The rule then delved into the details of everyday life, and this is where its obsessive nature and psychology become fascinating. Take diet, for example. A traditional Benedictine monk would have a largely vegetarian diet. But Bernard and Hugo knew that a man who spends his days on horseback and fighting with a heavy sword cannot live on bread and water. The rule, therefore, decreed that knights could eat meat 3 times a week, on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. This was a pragmatic and revolutionary concession to the physical reality of their work. Bodily strength was necessary for the service of God. At other meals, the food would be simple, 2 or 3 courses of vegetables and pulses. And, in a touch of enforced camaraderie, siblings would eat in pairs, sharing the same bowl, so that each could watch the other and make sure no one was eating more than their share or complaining about the food. The rules about dress were equally specific. Each knight was entitled to a limited number of pieces of clothing, a tunic, trousers, shoes. The bedding consisted of a straw mattress, a sheet, and a blanket. Luxury was the enemy. No skins were permitted, except for sheepskin, and then only as winter lining. All clothing had to be of simple, sober colors. Vanity was a sin to be eradicated. The knight did not dress to impress, but to serve. But the most revealing part of the rule, our marginal historical curiosity, concerns communication. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the greatest communicators of his time, seems to have had a deep distrust of idle talk. The Templar rule imposed a regime of almost constant silence. Meals were to be eaten in absolute silence, while a brother read aloud from the scriptures. After the evening prayer, compline, there was total silence until the following morning. Speaking without permission was a punishable offense. For daily needs, a rudimentary system of sign language developed. If a brother needed bread, he would make a circle gesture with his hands. If he needed wine, he would put his index finger to his nose. This practice was not just to foster a contemplative atmosphere. It had a very practical purpose. It prevented the formation of cliques, the spread of rumors and dissent. It controlled the flow of information absolutely, and this control extended to the outside world. The rule strictly forbade all private correspondence. A knight could not receive letters from his family, not even from his mother or fiancée, if he had one before entering the order, without the express permission of the master. And even if permission was granted, the letter had to be read aloud in the presence of the master. The same applied to sending letters. Likewise, personal gifts were forbidden. If a knight's family sent him a gift, he had to deliver it to his master, who would decide whether the knight could keep it, or whether it would be given to another brother who needed it more. This system effectively severed the knight's ties to his past and his family, ensuring that his only loyalty, his only family, was now to the order. It was a form of institutionalized brainwashing, designed to create a perfectly obedient and focused soldier. The rule also addressed sin and discipline. There was a list of offences that could lead to loss of the mantle, expulsion from the order, simony, buying or selling ecclesiastical offices, revealing the secrets of the chapter, fleeing from a battle with infidels, and sodomy were among the capital crimes. For lesser offences such as murmuring, disobeying an order, or bragging, the punishment was lighter, more humiliating. The guilty knight was required to eat off the mess floor for a period of time, or was assigned to the dirtiest work in the stables, or was subjected to a ritual flogging. The goal was correction, not revenge, and reinstatement into the brotherhood. Finally, after days of debate, writing, and revision, the parchment was completed. The 72 clauses were read aloud before the entire council. It was a remarkable document, a delicate balance between Bernard's ascetic ideal and Hugh's practical needs. It was a blueprint for a military and religious utopia. With its final approval, the Council of Troy had done more than recognize the Templars. It had given them their soul in written form. Hugh de Payon received an official copy of the document. Its pages still smelled of fresh ink. This small scroll of parchment was now the most precious thing he possessed. It was proof of his legitimacy. It was his recruitment tool. It was the code that would transform unruly young nobles into knights of Christ. He could now return to the castles and courts of Europe, not only with stories of the Holy Land, but with an official document sanctioned by the Pope that outlined exactly what it meant to be a Templar. The rule was not just a set of rules. It was a promise of a life of purpose, discipline, and salvation through the sword. It was the instruction manual for a holy war machine. The project was complete. Now it was time to find men willing to live and die for it. Vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. With the Latin rule in hand, a scroll of parchment that contained the essence of their identity, Hugh de Payon and his companions now had a gospel to preach. Their recruitment campaign in Europe was transformed. It was no longer just about appealing to fervor and emotion. It was a matter of presenting a contract, a clear and definite pact with God and with the order. When a young nobleman, perhaps the third son of a baron with little prospect of inheriting lands, approached Hugh to learn more, he was not promised riches or easy glory. Instead, he was presented with the challenge of the 3 traditional monastic vows, now reinterpreted for the battlefield: poverty, chastity, and obedience. These were not new concepts. They had been the backbone of monastic life for over 500 years, but to tear them from the contemplative silence of a cloister and plant them in the middle of a military camp was the essence of the Templar revolution. To analyze these 3 vows, as the Templars lived them, is to delve into the heart of their paradox and their power. The first vow, and perhaps the most shocking to the mindset of a medieval knight, was poverty. The knightly class was defined by possessions. A man was his castle, his lands, the quality of his horse, the shine of his armor. Wealth was a visible sign of God's favor and earthly success. To renounce all this was to go against the very nature of his being. When a candidate was accepted into the order, the initiation ceremony was an act of total destitution. He had to give all his possessions, lands, money, castles, everything to the order. He arrived as a lord, and after his vows, he did not even own the shirt he was wearing. He became a pauper, a poor man. However, as we have seen, this was a purely individual poverty. The rule was explicit. No brother would have anything of his own. But the order, as a corporate entity, could accumulate unlimited wealth. And he accumulated. This is our widely known historical fact. The immense wealth of the Temple Order, which eventually made them the international bankers of Christendom. An individual Templar was a beggar. The Order of the Temple was a financial titan. The knight could not have a single coin in his pocket, but his order could finance kings and popes. This structure created a fascinating psychology. It freed the knight from worldly concerns. He did not need to worry about managing his lands, collecting rents, or paying debts. His food, his clothes, his weapons, his horse, everything was provided by the order. His only concern was to train, pray, and fight. It was a form of radical minimalism that focused him entirely on his mission. Individual poverty made him a more effective soldier, and collective wealth made the order a more powerful military force, able to equip its men with the best equipment money could buy. It was a poverty of luxury, a paradox that their enemies would later use against them, but which, for almost 200 years, was the key to their success. The second vow was chastity. For a young nobleman in a society that saw marriage as a tool for political alliances and male descent, As an imperative for the continuation of the lineage, the vow of celibacy was a profound renunciation. It meant the end of their family line, the abandonment of any hope of having a wife and children. But in the minds of the order, chastity was a source of strength. Bernard of Clairvaux, in his In Praise of the New Chivalry, wrote disdainfully of secular knights who went into battle laden with the long hair of their mistresses. The Knight of Christ, on the other hand, was free from such distractions. The rule was obsessive in policing this vow. Purity of body was seen as a reflection of purity of soul. And here we find our marginal historical curiosity, which gives us a bizarre and moving insight into their anxieties. To avoid any temptation, however slight, the rule decreed that the common dormitory should always have a light burning all night. Why? So that the dark enemy, the devil, could not incite to sin. The idea was that even in sleep, in the darkness, temptation could strike. The constant light was a spiritual shield, a night guard against the demons of lust. Furthermore, knights were expected to sleep dressed in their shirts and trousers, and with a belt, to minimize contact with their own bodies and those of others. The rule explicitly forbade hugs and kisses, even to members of one's own family, such as a mother or sister. The only woman a Templar could look at without sin was the Virgin Mary. The feminine world was almost completely erased from his existence. This created an intensely masculine brotherhood, a closed society where the only emotional bonds permitted were between brothers in arms, a camaraderie forged in shared celibacy and common danger. The third vow, and perhaps the most important from a military point of view, was obedience. A feudal army was notoriously undisciplined. They were a proud collection of individuals, each a formidable warrior, but often reluctant to follow orders if it would hurt their pride or jeopardize their personal glory. The history of the Crusades is littered with battles lost because an impetuous nobleman launched a premature charge, disobeying the overall plan. The Templars' vow of obedience was designed to eradicate this problem. The rule stated unequivocally, whatever the master orders must be done without hesitation, as if it were an order from God. This obedience was absolute and unquestionable. If the master ordered a knight to clean the latrines, he would obey. If you ordered him to charge a seemingly impenetrable line of enemy lances, he would obey. This discipline made the Templars a cohesive and devastating fighting unit. On the battlefield, they moved as a single entity, a war machine controlled by a single will. When the Templar battle flag, the boccia, was raised, no knight could leave the formation while it was standing, even if he was seriously wounded. His obedience overcame his instinct for self-preservation. For a nobleman who was accustomed to being his own master, submitting his will so completely was the greatest sacrifice of all. It meant the death of the ego, the renunciation of the pride that was the currency of his world. But like the other vows, this renunciation brought a form of liberation. The knight no longer had to bear the burden of decision-making in the heat of battle. He did not need to think, he only needed to obey. This terrifying simplicity was the secret of his lethal effectiveness. Together, these three vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience functioned as an integrated system designed to dismantle a secular nobleman and rebuild him as a knight of Christ. Poverty broke his attachment to the material world. Chastity broke his attachment to family and romantic ties. And obedience broke his attachment to his own will and pride. What was left was a perfectly honed instrument, totally dedicated to order. When Hugh of Payens and Bernard of Clairvaux presented this package to potential recruits, they were not offering an easy life. They were offering a life of deprivation, discipline, and danger. But they were also offering something that many young nobles desperately craved: a clear, unambiguous purpose. In an age of intense faith, they were offering a direct path to salvation, a way to serve God not with silent prayer in a distant monastery, but with action at the center of the world. They were offering a form of holiness to men who were born to fight, and for many, the hardness of the vows was not an impediment. It was proof of the authenticity and value of their vocation. The difficulty of the path was a sign that it led to a worthwhile destination. And so they came. The sons of European nobility came, ready to exchange their sables for coarse wool, their castles for the common dormitory, and their freedom for absolute obedience. They were ready to take the vows and become Templars, the symbol of the white cloak with the red cross. The new order now had a rule, a house, a mission, and a growing pool of recruits willing to take the most demanding vows. Yet something vital was missing from the visual and hierarchical world of the Middle Ages. A clear visual identity, a uniform that would instantly distinguish them on the battlefield and in the public mind. In their early years, the Templars were a functional but confused sight. They were a collection of knights dressed in their own armor and coats of various colors, united by purpose but not by appearance. They were effective, but visually indistinct. This lack of uniformity was not just a matter of aesthetics. It was a practical and marketing problem. On a chaotic battlefield, covered in dust and smoke, the ability to instantly recognize friend from foe was a matter of life and death. And in Europe, where the order competed for donations and recruits with countless other religious institutions, having a strong, recognizable brand was crucial. They needed a logo. The solution came, once again, from their great patron, Bernard of Clairvaux, and was formalized in the years following the Council of Troyes. The idea was elegantly simple, but loaded with profound symbolism. The Knights of the Order, the fighting elite, would be granted the right to wear a white cloak over their armor. White, in an age when dyes were expensive and most people dressed in the dull, earthy tones of undyed wool, pure white was a color of distinction. But its significance went far beyond status. In Christian symbolism, white was the color of purity, innocence, and renunciation of the world. It was the color of angels, of the robes of the saints in heaven, and of Christ's robe after the resurrection. By dressing his warrior monks in white, Bernard was making a powerful theological statement. These men, despite being blood-spilling soldiers, were pure of heart. Their vow of chastity and their dedication to a holy cause cleansed their souls, making them spotless in the eyes of God. The white cloak was an outward sign of his inner purity, transforming the warrior into an avenging angel. It was also a symbol of deliberate contrast. Secular knights, as Bernard was fond of pointing out, loved colorful, gaudy clothes, scarlet reds, rich blues, vibrant greens, as a display of their wealth and vanity. The Templars' simple white was a visual rebuke to this luxury. It said, "I have renounced the vanities of the world. My only loyalty is to Christ." It was at once an act of humility and a declaration of spiritual superiority. However, a white robe alone was not enough. It was too generic. Other monastic orders, such as Bernard's own Cistercians, also wore white. They needed something more, a symbol that spoke not only of their purity, but also of their specific mission. The solution was to add a cross, but not just any cross, Around 1147, almost 2 decades after the Council of Troas, during the preparations for the Second Crusade, Pope Eugene III, himself a former Cistercian monk and disciple of Bernard of Clairvaux, granted the Templars the right to wear a red cross on the left shoulder of their white cloaks. This is our widely known historical fact. The adoption of the red cross on the white cloak, which became the iconic and indelible image of the Order of the Temple. The combination was visually stunning and symbolically perfect. Red on white, blood on purity. The cross was bright red, the color of blood, and represented martyrdom. It was a constant reminder that they were men willing to shed their own blood for Christ, following his example on the cross. Each time a knight donned his cloak, he was wearing a symbol of his potential martyrdom. He was declaring to the world that he did not fear death in battle. For as Bernard had taught them, dying fighting for the faith was a direct shortcut to heaven. The red cross was a mark of courage and a ticket to eternity. The shape of the cross could vary, but the one most commonly associated with the Templars was the coapete, a cross with arms that taper toward the center and widen at the ends. Its bold, symmetrical form was graphically powerful, easily recognizable from a distance. The combination of the white mantle and the red cross was therefore a masterpiece of symbolic design. It told the entire history of the order at a glance. Purity of intention, white, and readiness for sacrifice, red. It created one of the most enduring images of the Middle Ages. A detachment of Templar knights charging into battle, their white cloaks flowing behind them, the red cross shining against the white like a sacred wound, must have been an inspiring sight to their allies and utterly terrifying to their enemies. They seemed like an otherworldly force, unstoppable and incorruptible. However, not everyone in the order was entitled to wear this iconic combination. And here is where we find our marginal historical curiosity, which reveals the rigid class structure within the order itself. The Order of the Temple was not composed only of knights of noble birth. The vast majority of its members were, in fact, the sergeant brothers, fratres servientes. These men came from more humble backgrounds, small landowners, merchants, artisans. They were foot soldiers, crossbowmen, or light cavalrymen. They were the backbone of the order's military and administrative strength, outnumbering the knights sometimes by 10 to 1. But they could not wear the white cloak. White was an exclusive privilege of the aristocratic elite of knights. Instead, the sergeant brothers wore a black or dark brown cloak. They too bore the red cross, but on a dark background. This distinction of colors was a clear visual representation of the social hierarchy that the order, despite its vows of poverty and humility, had imported directly from the feudal world. Their uniform reflected their class. They could fight and die alongside the knights, but they would never be their equals. They were brothers in faith, but not in status. This internal division, this sartorial apartheid, is a fascinating reminder that however radical the order was, it remained a product of its time. Unable to fully escape the deeply embedded social structures of medieval Europe, its uniform now complete, the order's visual identity was cemented. The white mantle and red cross became their universal symbol. It was used not only on their mantles, but also on their flags, their seals, and in the architecture of their churches. The most famous of their battle flags was the boccia, or balcento. It was a simple but impressive flag. Split horizontally, the top half was black and the bottom half white. Its meaning was interpreted in many ways. To some, it represented the duality of the order, the lion's ferocity toward its enemies, black, and the lamb's gentleness toward its friends, white. To others, it symbolized the transition from a life of sin, black, to a life of purity in the order, white. Whatever the interpretation, its message on the battlefield was unmistakable. As long as the bokya was raised, the battle continued. Retreat was unthinkable. Thus, dressed in their symbolic purity and marked with the sign of martyrdom, the Templars rode into history. Their uniform was not just clothing. It was theology, propaganda, and a psychological weapon. It was the visible manifestation of their strange and powerful calling, a declaration that they were something new, something different. They were the white angels of holy war, and their mark was about to spread across the known world. Recruitment and expansion in Europe. The journey of Hugo de Payens and his companions back to Europe, which began as a desperate diplomatic mission, turned into a triumphant victory tour. After the resounding success of the Council of Troy, they were no longer petitioners begging for arms. They were celebrities, the architects of a new and exciting way of serving God, with the papally approved rule in their pockets, and the eloquent endorsement of Bernard of Clairvaux echoing throughout the dioceses. Doors that had previously been only half open now swung wide. The Order of the Temple, born in the dust of Palestine, was about to take deep root in the rich and fertile soil of Europe. The expansion that followed was explosive, a growth phenomenon that would make any modern startup envious. Hugo's strategy was brilliant. He didn't just return to Jerusalem with a handful of new recruits and a few bags of gold. He understood that if the order was to survive in the long term, it needed a permanent infrastructure in Europe. It needed a logistical network to funnel a steady stream of men, money, and resources to the war effort in the Holy Land. Outremer would be the front line, but Europe would be the rear base, the beating heart that pumped blood and nutrients to the tip of the spear. His tour became a campaign to establish commanderies or preceptories. When a pious nobleman, moved by Hugh's sermon or a letter from Bernard, donated property to the order, a farm, a mill, a forest, sometimes an entire castle, Hugh did not simply sell the property for a quick buck. Instead, he established a small Templar base of operations there. This base, the commandery, was a miniature version of the temple in Jerusalem. It was a recruiting center, a fundraising center, and a farm all rolled into one. A typical commandery would be run by an older knight, perhaps a wounded veteran who could no longer fight on the front lines, or a sergeant brother with a talent for administration. He supervised the work of the lay brothers, the hired peasants, and the serfs who worked the land. The profits generated by the agricultural exploitation, the sale of wool, grain, wine, or timber, did not enrich the local brothers. A part was used for their subsistence, but the great majority was sent east to finance the war. Each commandery was a financial pipeline straight to Jerusalem. Its expansion followed the lines of power and piety in Europe. In France, its country of origin, success was immediate. The Count of Champagne, Hugh's lord, was one of the earliest and most generous benefactors. Soon the French countryside was dotted with Templar commanderies. From France, Hugh travelled to Normandy and then crossed the English Channel to England, where he was received with honours by King Henry I. The Templars' first London headquarters was established in Holborn, and they quickly received grants of land throughout the country. Their journey then took them south to the lands of Anjou, Poitou, and crucially, the Iberian Peninsula. In Spain and Portugal, the Templars found particularly fertile ground for their vocation. This is our widely known historical costume. The Templars played a major role in the Reconquista, the long struggle of the Iberian Christian kingdoms to reclaim territory from the Muslim Moors. For the kings of Aragon, Castile, and Portugal, the arrival of an elite order of warrior monks was not just welcome, it was a gift from God. Here, the Templars did not need to travel to Jerusalem to fight the infidels. Their holy war was on their doorstep. They were granted vast land grants and castles in the border areas, becoming an essential part of the war machine of the Reconquista. In places like Tomar Castle in Portugal, they built some of their most impressive and innovative fortresses. The recruitment process was an art in itself. The appeal was multifaceted. For the deeply pious, it was an opportunity to live a life of devotion and sacrifice, with the assurance of salvation. For the younger sons of the nobility, landlessness was an honorable career, an alternative to a life as a mercenary knight or an obscure ecclesiastical career. It offered adventure, purpose, and the opportunity to fight alongside some of Christendom's most respected warriors. The initiation ceremony was a solemn and secret event, usually held at night in the chapel of a commandery. This secrecy, designed to impress the candidate with the seriousness of the step he was taking, would later fuel suspicion and accusations. The candidate was questioned to ensure that he was not married, that he had no debts, and that he did not belong to another order. Then he knelt and took his vows, giving his life and will to the order until death. Upon admission, he received the cloak, white for a knight, black or brown for a sergeant. This cloak was his new symbol of identity. He ceased to be John, the son of the Baron of Tal, to become Brother John, a Templar. His old identity was erased, replaced by his new corporate identity. In the midst of this explosive growth, we find our marginal historical curiosity, which illustrates how deeply the order had infiltrated the fabric of everyday European life. In addition to large land grants, the Templars benefited from a steady stream of smaller donations and privileges. One of the most curious was the right to hold their own alms collection once a year in every church in a diocese. During their visit, they were allowed to preach and solicit donations. And most remarkably, when a Templar preacher arrived in a town that was under an interdict, an ecclesiastical punishment in which all churches were closed and all sacraments except baptism suspended, the churches were allowed to open for one day in honor of the Templar's visit. Imagine the impact of this. In a town where the bells had been silent and the church doors had been locked for months, where people could not marry, confess, or bury their dead in consecrated ground, the arrival of a white-robed Templar brother was like a visit from the Pope himself. It brought with it a day of spiritual relief, a day when God's grace would flow once more. This privilege gave the Templars immense power and prestige among the general population. They were not just defenders of the Holy Land, they were seen as special intermediaries, men whose holiness could temporarily nullify even the Church's harshest punishments. It was a public relations tool of genius. In less than a decade, the landscape of Europe had changed. The small seed that Hugo de Payens had taken from Jerusalem had grown into a vast network, a forest of commanderies, stretching from Portugal to Scotland. This network was not just an empire of lands, it was a system designed for one purpose only, to support the war in the East. Farms in France produced the money to buy war horses in Syria. Young men recruited in England would be sent to garrison fortresses in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Wool from sheep in Spain would be sold to pay the freight for ships carrying supplies from Italy to the port of Acre. It was a multinational corporation dedicated to the Holy War, the first and perhaps the most successful in history. When Hugh of Payens finally returned to Jerusalem around 1130, he did not return hand over fist. He returned at the head of a wave of new recruits, their purses bulging with property titles and promises of financial support. He had left as the leader of a small local garrison. He returned as the Grand Master of an international power. He had secured the future of his order. He had built the machine. Now was time to get to work in earnest, defending the Holy Land. Genesis was over. The golden age of the Templars was about to begin.